Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sunday service. In case you don't know us, my name is Bharati, this is Lorna, and it's our joy to be with you this morning. I was just thinking as Lorna was reading the end of the affirmation prayer about true sanity, I was reading a little quotation in a magazine this week, and it was a well-known author whose name, of course, I can't remember at the moment, but he said, well, he'd been asked, what's the difference between fiction and reality? He said, well, that's easy. Fiction has to make sense. So there you go. I was thinking also about the last part of our reading where it was saying, those who worship lesser gods go to their gods. And I was thinking, well, who are these lesser gods? And in the Old Testament, in the Bible, we read about some gods, different gods that people worshipped and so forth, as compared with the Jehovah God of the Old Testament. But I thought, well, I don't know, that didn't seem too likely coming from the Bhagavad Gita. But looking in the extended version in Rays of the Same Light, Swami Kriyananda talks about how there are other things that we put before God, so that we worship in our own way. And that might be things like money, could be things like fame, could be relationships. Whatever we put our attention on and devote our life to, that becomes, in effect, a God for us. In education, there's a maxim, and I'm sure it's probably in other disciplines as well, but basically it's in regard to children and their behavior. What you focus on, you get more of. And that's very true. What we put our attention on seems to increase in our lives. If we're going for fame, we'll eventually get it. Usually what happens when we find it, when we do get it, we find that it isn't what we thought at all, and it doesn't satisfy us in the same way. There's other things that can become essentially gods for us. Things like pride of pedigree, which is one that Yogananda mentioned often as being very common in his time. Another one I think that I've noticed, of course, we always notice these things in ourselves, first of all, or we notice them in other people and then we realize they're in ourselves, and that's why we notice them so much in other people, is the tendency to judgment, wanting approval of the world. And so when we want approval, what we often feel is disapproval. And when we do that, we take it into ourselves and feel like we're not worthy, and we start to judge frequently ourselves most of all, but also other people. And that doesn't take us very far. That's usually not where we'd prefer to live. So putting God first makes a lot of sense. That takes you, putting your attention and your energy in that direction, that takes you where you actually want to go. I remember when I was in high school, and quite possibly before then, I always felt like, I was there, I was part of a church. I grew up more or less in the Presbyterian church, and my relationship with it was pretty much of a social nature. I was very active. I belonged to the youth group. I was half the time president of the youth group and, sang in the choir, did these things. But I couldn't get what it was really about, I'd sit through service, they'd talk about God and Jesus and stuff, and I really wanted to be there with it and just didn't know how to get there. And I was always asking in different in Sunday school classes and youth group and stuff. It's like, what is it we believe? On the one hand, when I was in a high school literature class, we were reading some, more early American writings, and we were reading Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which, is like the lightning bolts. You're waiting for it to come down and strike you. You'd be flung in the fires, the pits of hell. And then when I understood that this is kind of one of the people whose underlying teachings have turned into the Presbyterian Church, or at least that was my understanding at that time, I'm going, this doesn't relate to what I hear on Sundays. It just seems like a totally different world. So I'd be kind of asking, well, what is it we believe? What is it we believe? And finally, our minister, long-suffering, very kind man, gave me a copy of the Catechism, which I didn't even know the Presbyterian Church had. I thought that was for Catholics, You go to catechism on Saturdays if you don't go to a Catholic school. But the thing that really kind of blew my mind when I started reading it, I was looking at what is the purpose of life. And, it's all in question and answer format. And I probably have the details wrong here because I frequently do. But basically what it said, I was thinking, is this the purpose of life or the purpose of mankind or whatever? But anyway, the purpose of something. And it's to love God and enjoy Him forever. Well, when I read that, I was just going like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Because for one thing, it totally didn't go with sinners in the hands of an angry God. But it also totally didn't go with my experience. Because I thought, well, how do you do that? First of all, how can you love someone, enjoy someone, if you don't know them? Although, then I was thinking about, the Peanuts cartoons and Lucy, and her thing about, well, I love humanity. It's people I can't stand. So, in that way, yes, sometimes it's easier to love and enjoy things that we don't actually have any understanding of. But I was always just wondering, trying to make something of it. But, I just kind of couldn't get it, and then I'd let it go for a time. And some years later, it'd kind of come back, and I'd be going, well, what's this all about? So then I started looking at other different denominations of Protestantism and just Christianity in general. I started looking at some of the other world religions. When I was in college, I went on an overseas study program to Iran and lived there for a while. So I was exposed to Islam and also the Baha'i faith. And again, I could see individual people who were really transformed, actually, by their experience of God through these forms, but it just wasn't there for me. And I learned a little bit about Buddhism, went to a Buddhist monastery and spent some time there, Hinduism and so forth, but it just wasn't really happening for me. And then at some time along the way, I don't know exactly where, I picked up a book. Now, I'm typically a fiction reader. I don't really care for nonfiction that much. I want it painlessly, whether it's history. I don't want to read the history book. I want historical fiction, so I get it in just a nice, gentle, interesting, because heaven knows nonfiction can't be interesting, right? Sort of way. But anyway, I was somewhere, and probably my sister's house, and I picked up a book. It was by Neville Shute, who is most well known probably for his book On the Beach, which was about, the atomic explosion and basically the end of the world slowly. But it's not one of my favorites of his books by any means. So that wasn't the one I picked up, fortunately. I did pick up one that was very, very interesting and had a big impact on my life. It was called Round the Bend. And that's a typical kind of British term for someone who's lost it, you know. They're crazy, basically. They've gone round the bend. And in the story, there is a young man, well, there's two young men who get to know each other when they're boys, and they work for a traveling air show, a circus that takes people on rides. And this happens all in the probably 30s, 1930s, and then goes into maybe the 50s. This book was actually published in 1951, which for its time, I think it was really amazing. But anyway, one of the young men is engineer, an aircraft engineer, and he does the maintenance and so forth on planes. But he's Russian and Chinese. So, which in England at that time, he was considered kind of, you know, odd and so forth. And he ends up living in the Middle East and in the East. And he becomes interested in different religions. But his way of working with that, he sees that people in many places around the world, as they become more interested in science and technology, again, this was back in the 30s, 40s, that they lose their religious understanding, or they think that it's, you know, not good anymore, that this science and technology is better. It becomes essentially their religion, but they can't really live that way. So oftentimes, people then become very unhappy. They become sloppy workers. But this character in the book, the way he looks at things and the way he talks to people in the area where he is, he always finds out about the religion in that particular area. And then he talks to the other engineers, the other mechanics that he's working with, and tries to give them back the supportive elements of their own religion by couching it in terms such as these. So he'll be working on an airplane and he's cranking off a screw, and I don't know anything about how this works, so I'm totally making this up at this point. But anyway, he's working on the engine of the plane, doing whatever he does, and he talks to them, and it's like, well, you know, in this one particular scene, he's in the Middle East, he's in an Islamic area, and so he's talking to them about Allah and how Allah requires ordinary people to pray 5 times a day. And he says to them, well, you know, that wasn't the way it was originally. Originally, they were supposed to pray 50 times a day. But it was like, oh no, how could they do that? You know, that's just too much. So he keeps going back to God and getting it reduced till it's down to 5 times a day. But this guy is telling the other engineers, it's like, well, that's fine for the common people, but you're educated men. You know, you're skilled. You can do more, and more is expected of you. And how can you do that? You don't want to stop working 50 times a day to pray. Here's what you can do. As you're doing your work, each time you come to some little process, you stop and pause for a moment and just ask God, is this done correctly? Have I done it the way it needs to be done? And then you just stop and listen, and God will tell you, yes, it's done, go ahead with what you need to do next, or not such a good job, get some help. Ask somebody. Don't pretend like it's okay when you don't think it is. And in this way, you can pray many more than 50 times a day. And when I was reading this, because he did the same thing with engineers who were Hindu, who were Sikhs, who whatever their religion was, it didn't matter. The principles were the same, that you would, whatever you were doing, whether it was, you know, tightening a nut or whatever else you do, putting on the little wires and all, you can stop and ask God. Talk to God in every circumstance. And in that way, you end up praying without ceasing. I realized for myself somewhere along the line that part of my issue with not feeling like I could know God was that I was always looking for something outside myself. There I was asking, what do we believe? What do we believe? And somebody's supposed to tell me, this is what we believe. You know, and they kind of said that. It's like, well, look at the Apostles' Creed, or, you know, I believe in whatever, God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. And, you know, but then I realized at some point, I don't know what I'm saying here. Who the heck is the communion of saints? I didn't think we had saints, you know? But so I ended up really feeling like, whoa, I don't get it. But at some point, it did become clear to me that the only way we can really find what's truly ours, our own path, is to look within, to go within. And we have lots of different ways to do that. And we have the guidance of some really amazing people. There's a little book that we have available in the boutique, and it's called Practicing His Presence. And one thing that's especially wonderful about this is it has excerpts from the writings of two people. One is Brother Lawrence, who wrote in the late 1600s. He was just a monk in a little monk in a monastery somewhere. And his book was called Practicing the Presence of God. And then Frank Laubach, who many of you have heard about, he was Letters of a Modern Mystic, I believe, was one of his books, which is usually out of print. And so that's why it's especially nice that this book exists, because you can have excerpts, at least from his writings, in this little volume. So from both of them. And, you know, I was thinking I'd read you a little selection from here, but then I went, you know, I'd have to read you the entire book, because there's just no stopping once you get started. It is so amazing. And it's just what we know, and then giving us hints on ways to do it. There's chapter 8 is called Practical Help. So the part leading up to that is he's giving you some idea why you would want to do this, but practical help. We shall not become like Christ until we give him more time. A teacher's college requires students to attend classes 25 hours a week for 3 years. If we give God, 3 minutes a day, then it's going to take a really, really long time before we can establish a real relationship here. So part of it is, and again, he ends up saying the same thing that I found in that novel. If you start to include God in everything you do, whatever in the course of your day, whether you're cooking, you're working with a student, you're working on a brief for a law case, you're plastering, or whatever you're doing, you can just have an ongoing conversation with God and include Divine Mother in everything you're doing, playing, working, resting, and asking for advice and guidance and just sharing, because that's the way you get to know God, and that's the way we can form that relationship, that we can put first things first, that we can seek the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to us. What if we aren't there yet? Which, I don't know, that's certainly true for me. What amazes me most of all, when I look at my own life in this regard, is how often I just totally forget. I'll be struggling with some issue, and I'll be trying to think my way through, or I'll I'll be looking, reading this, reading that, going, and I totally forget. Eventually I will, because it usually gets to the point where there's just no way out. And finally, but it's like, duh, if only I could have done this sooner. But the fact of the matter is, your intention is the part that's important. Divine Mother knows our hearts. She loves us as we are and will help us if we ask for that help. I'm going to end with just a short reading from Whispers from Eternity. O fountain of love, flood the lowlands of our love for home and family with thy omnipresent love. O mighty source of all our rivers of desire, teach us not to cut ourselves off from thee, hunting on dry sands of sense satisfaction. Love is our soul's birthright. We demand now that all the rivers of our cravings be redirected through valleys of humility, eager self-sacrifice, and concern for others, until, reinforced by thy torrential blessings, they merge in the ocean of all fulfillment in thee. Bless us that the rivulets of our sympathy, affection, and love lose not themselves in the sands of dreary selfishness. Let the little, lonely, separately moving streamlets of our love, which come from thee, merge at last in the vastness of thy perfect love. We'll have just a moment.